In conclusion, Losvanaja Emjor said, putting her four hands together as she looked around at all the representatives and their company that had come together for the Council of Primates. Her eyes and fur were glowing. However, the expression spoke of some barely hidden regret that plagued her even now, as she gave her closing speech for the event. The Council of Primates has decided to await further developments on the galactic stage before agreeing on any unified stance. With the election down on the next branch, we have additionally decided to cooperate closely with the future Galactic Council once it is decided upon, and support its handling of the galactic situation with all our freely available resources. However, until then, each individual member is free to support or withhold support to whatever side they deem in the right or in the wrong individually, at their own discretion, without it being considered a hostile or unfriendly act to any other member who might decide to do differently. It is not an ideal solution, but the keeping of the peace within our ranks is the highest priority at the current moment. We are not enemies. We are one. I urge each and every one of you not to forget that. She sighed slightly. It is a pity that no overarching decision could be reached on our own, but it is understandable that the stakes for some of our members on the matter are too high to simply find a compromise in such a short-lived setting, she continued, once she had discreetly vented out some of her frustration. And while it would have been ideal to present a unified stance to the galaxy, one of the primate's virtues has never been stubbornness. So we won't force a desired result like mindless drones. Instead, we are going to civilly disagree and open the discussion up to wider council. She turned her pointy head and looked around the room to take in every individual. Thank you very much, to all of you, for your valuable time and attention. We know it is not given naturally or carelessly, and therefore please accept our gratitude for attending, she said, and bowed deeply on the small podium she was sitting on. Then she stood up again. And once again, we wish the best of luck to all of us who will be partaking in the election as candidates. May all of you get the support you need and deserve from the galaxy. She brought her hands together yet again, and the glow of her body increased exponentially for a moment, as she concluded her speech. Hereby, the conference is officially closed. Please, everyone, get home safely. Thank you so much for being here, and we are looking forward to the next time we meet. What followed was a round of applause, although admittedly, it wasn't exactly super enthusiastic. It was still a level above mere courtesy clapping, however. It lacked the energy and bite of a true standing ovation. Most likely because no one was truly satisfied with the conclusion. It had been a compromise, on all sides. They had simply agreed to live and let live. Not really a convincing stance to take as a group. In fact, it is exactly what people not in a group would do. Still, James saw it as a win. He had been the odd one out from the start, so managing it that at least everyone wasn't banding together against him was probably a success, even if he would have gladly taken way more than that. This result of the primates all sitting on the proverbial fence together until they decided to jump off on one side out of their own convenience was still pretty bitter in the end. But he had done what he could. Short of threatening to personally ram his fist down the throat of everyone who dared lean into a different direction than the one he desired, in a literal or proverbial way, there was little he could still do to change their minds. The next battle would be fought on a larger scale. But at least he seemed to have gained the support of some. The Pixemeria appeared to be firmly on his side, and they had likely been amenable from the start, given their Homo's proximity and relationship to a Deathworld. And he seemed to have gotten some of the other primate species at least interested in the idea of a peaceful realized. It was just left to hope he could keep that interest alive, and, more importantly, that interest was stronger than whatever fear-mongering they would be confronted with in the future. After the applause ended, Losavanaja gave one last nod towards the camera, or probably towards her son holding the camera, before the footage cut out. And like that, it was over. No longer was James primate representative of the humans. Now, he would have to become James Councilman-to-be, whatever that would mean. Now that the camera was shut off, he sunk into his seat a bit with his shoulders slouched, and he ran a hand over his face. The cold feeling of his polymeric skin felt nice on his hot face. By now, he had gotten mostly used to the darn heat that was all surrounding everywhere where standard conditions were being maintained, of course, but that still didn't mean that he liked it. Therefore, he held his cool hand to his forehead and closed his eyes as he enjoyed the feeling of the cold material pressing against his damp skin. He let out a long exhale and focused entirely on the sensation as he attempted to empty his mind completely, just for a short time. The constant thoughts running through his head were starting to gain in intensity, and most of the time it felt like something was pressing against his skull from the inside, trying to break his way out. It wasn't painful in any way, it was just pressure. He exhaled slowly and tried his best to banish the feeling, simply focusing on the pleasant feeling of gentle coldness against his skin. To his own surprise, it actually worked. Only momentarily, of course, but for a second, he actually did manage to empty his head, and the pressure all but disappeared. It wouldn't stay like that, he knew it, but he enjoyed it while it lasted. Councilman, he thought to himself, with his eyes remaining closed. How would I be a councilman? He curled his lips in and gently chewed on them with his incisors in a massaging motion while he mulled it over. He had already been guaranteed full support within reason by humanity's Council of Governance, the highest authority there was in their territory. And while they surely had a strategy prepared that they wished for him to follow when it came to where to go and when and why to advertise himself to the voters, he had also been strongly encouraged in the meantime to make up his mind about how he wished to present himself, so that a strategy could be formed around that. It's easier if you don't have to pretend too much, he had been told. But you're going to need a persona. Something large, something more than yourself. Something that people can latch on to. We don't want to lie to the people, of course, but we also don't want to bore them. You had a good thing with your first big speech during the conference. The loudness, the in-your-face nature, the done-with-the-games attitude. People can connect with that, you know? I mean, who never wanted to really stick it to someone before? If that's something you're interested in, we can work with that. Or something else. Think about it. Just remember, we don't need you to act, but we need you to put on a show. He pressed his hand over his mouth and exhaled sharply for his fingers. Put on a show, he mumbled, and flexed his fingers a bit. Once again, he felt the textured polymer rubbing against his skin. A show? Well, he was certainly eye-catching with this arm. Maybe he should base his brand on that. No, that would be a bit too garish. Sure, the acceptance of augmentations was a big part of his talking points, but it was never a good idea to turn your politics into your entire identity. It would alienate people too quickly. While at the conference, he had made it a paradigm to stick it to the event's rules, as if they were God-given law, in order to make himself appear reasonable, even as he had let out his more aggressive side. However, that strategy wouldn't fly anymore from now on. There were no rules. He would have to sell himself, and just reasonable rarely sold well. He shifted his hand again, back up towards his forehead, with some fingers resting across his eyes. Through the slits in between them, he looked down to where his other arm was resting across his legs. The sleeve of his suit was covering it, of course, but for a moment it was as if he had X-ray vision, as an image briefly flashed through his mind, making it seem like he could look right through the fabric as he saw his forearm in front of his inner eye. The 5 deep, dark lines forming the claw marks across it sprang out to him, and along with them came the memory of the pictures. The one at Sheeda's promotion, and the later one just before they left the planet. He exhaled slowly and closed his eyes tightly, but then he smirked to himself. I should really stop being an idiot, he chuckled to himself while still grinning widely. The choice was made for me a long time ago. Sometime later, he stretched a bit before shielding his eyes from the cold light of the station, as he climbed out of the hatch that led into the secure room that he would be leaving for the last time now, at least supposedly. His elbow cracked as he stretched his arms out, and he held a hand protectively just above his eyes as he glanced around the highest roof for anything that might have been of concern to him. Seeing nothing of note, he sighed and ran his hand through his hair, swiping it all out of his face and slicking it back a bit in a smooth motion. Once that was done, he inhaled and kept his breath in for a couple of seconds while closing his eyes, before slowly releasing it in a controlled fashion. Only once his lungs were entirely empty and felt like they were folding up in his chest did he open his eyes again. "Showtime," he said, without making a single sound, as there was nowhere to carry it. "I do hope you are not too bored while you're waiting here for your cue," a Rushgak worker told James sometime later, while he and his team were waiting behind the scenes of the still ongoing Council of Deathworlders. They could hear the muffled sounds of the ongoing meeting just a room over, as they sat by and awaited the moment they would be invited to take the stage. "We would have liked to only call you in once we are ready to hear you, to not waste this much of your time. However, the schedule for today was uncertain, therefore we sadly had to make some compromises in the planning." James waved the insectoid's concerns off with a casual movement of his hand. "It's an honor to be heard by the Council of Deathworlders. Other candidates would kill for this kind of an opportunity to get their name and message out there, so please don't worry about it at all. A little waiting has never killed anybody," he assured them, with a relaxed and casual voice. "We will wait our turn and enjoy a rare moment of quiet before that." The worker released a chittering sound by vibrating their colourful wings, and bowed their head deeply while rubbing their long hands together. Then they stepped to the side to give the group some free space while they waited. The little side room they were in was dingy and barren, and the few items that were stored here were strewn about haphazardly, without much order to it. Still, it was more than spacious enough for the comparatively small Deathworlders to all have their sphere of personal space, even as they all waited together. Almost right after the worker had turned away, James felt the pressure of an elbow on his shoulder, as someone leaned on him from the side. "Can't wait to see the kind of performance you have prepared for us," Admir said cheekily, while putting his entire weight onto James, seemingly without a worry in the world about it. "The galaxy's first real taste of the man who's going to shake its very foundation. The beaver gnawing at the stem. The termite in their foundations. The bug under the bug. The little rock in Atlas's shoe." With each increasingly ridiculous metaphor, Admir's voice got less and less serious, as he hammed up the performance angle of his recitations, more and more, speaking like a bard on a stage, with a loud, pompous voice that chewed the absolute hell out of each word. James cracked up laughing and ended Admir's presentation with a forceful elbow to the side, which immediately caused his favourite X to crumple with a breathless laugh as he firmly pressed his hand onto the assaulted area. It had likely more surprised him than it had hurt, but the effect was all the same in the end. "You bet your ass I'm going to shake things up," James then said with a smirk, and leaned down a bit to be on Admir's eye level, as he still stood hunched over and held his side. Behind him, he could hear a surprised noise. "Oh!" Coco asked loudly, and in a few steps she was behind James, putting her arm over James's back to lean onto him much like Admir had done before. Unlike the lieutenant, she had to use the opportunity of James bending over to do it, since she couldn't usually reach his shoulder with her elbow without it looking extremely awkward due to the difference in height. "That's a new tune. What brought this on?" James released a breath through his nose, and remained bent forward for a moment so he wouldn't immediately throw the commander off again. "Well, if I said having the entire support of one of the galaxy's most powerful species behind me had nothing to do with it, I'd be lying," he laughed, before slowly pushing himself into an upright position, making her arm gently slide off his back as he did. "But also, think about it. All the people in history, good or bad, who really made a difference, again, good or bad, they all had something that made them stand out. They all had these big personalities. In their heads, they were all the undisputed heroes of their stories." He shrugged slightly with a mild chuckle. "I may not have that, but hey, maybe I can fake it till I make it," he said. "When people are so set in their ways, they need something to yank them out of it." While Admir slowly recovered from James's cheap shot and stood up again, James slowly pushed his sleeve up to reveal his forearm and the scars across it. He smirked slightly as he looked at it. "Gonna need your help, though," he said, and glanced around the room as he held his exposed arm out. He looked in the faces of each of his friends that were waiting here with him. "All of your help." With an amused exhale through her nose that made her body jump slightly, Coco was the first to join in with him. Without hesitation, she smoothly stroked her own sleeve off of her arm and held it stretched out next to James's. Admir joined in after only a moment. Then everyone else followed suit. Athena, Andres, Tuya, Nia, and last but certainly not least Shida, all brought their arms in. Everyone who willingly bore this same mark that James had on their arm, forming a circle of solidarity with their scars and tattoos. Their marks were a promise. They were a reminder. Even if he had the original, James was not the only one who was marked anymore. He was not special. He was not the chosen one. He was just one of many fighting the good fight. But if they had to, they all could play up their part. Although the words from the other room were too muffled to be understood by the humans, Shida's ears suddenly twitched up and rounded out widely, as a slightly louder addressing could be heard from the conference room. Not even a moment later, the worker slowly came scuttling over to them, with the assistant on their arm lighting up with a message. James smiled at the others, and clenched his hand into a tight ball. "Fist to the sky, guys," he said, a glimmer in his eyes as his gaze glided across theirs. Just moments later, the door to the main conference room was opened for them, allowing them to march through right into the middle of the ongoing council. James didn't even have to look twice to see all the cameras that were pointed in their directions, a sight he had gotten frighteningly used to by now. Without missing a beat, James tore his fist up into the air, his sleeve already pulled down in preparation as he presented his scars to the media under zooming lenses and flashing lights. He didn't look back, but he trusted that behind him, everyone else was doing the same. "Fist towards the sky," he thought to himself, and after taking a deep breath, he shifted his expression into a bright grin. "Smile for the camera, you might as well look the part." After a few steps into the room under a surrounding mumbling, James soon switched the raised fist into a waving motion, waving at the cameras first, and then at the surrounding representatives of the Deathworlder species. Well, at least the representatives of those species that had decided to join in on this little experimental conference. "Hello everyone," he greeted, as he walked up towards the main stage that he had last seen when it was still under construction, shortly before the conference had begun. "Thank you so much for having me." On the stage, it was Levexar who had taken over the role of presenter and moderator during the conference. As the room where everyone had gathered was much smaller than the one in the Fairbean Taxa Hotel that the primates had used for their event, even though there were far more Deathworld than primate species, the much more variably shaped Deathworlders were standing much closer together to each other, which included the presenter on stage himself. The slight elevation was basically the only thing that separated him from the rest of the representatives, very much unlike the position Losavannaja had taken, at the complete centre of attention, far away from everyone else but her helpers on her little podium, in the centre of the room. Levexar's green, stiff eyes stared at James, as he awaited the primate with an outstretched arm, that James quickly shook with his mechanical hand. His sleeve on the right arm wasn't as revealing as the left one, but it was pulled back ever so slightly to show off a bit more of the great prosthetic on any pictures that would be taken of the two representatives shaking hands. Luckily, Levexar had not a care in the world about touching artificial limbs, and so the handshake looked natural and calm. Meanwhile, the rest of James's team began to form up behind him. "Welcome, Ambassador," Levexar said, and a nearby microphone effortlessly picked up his voice without any interference, even from a slight distance. "Thank you for offering to say a few words on such short notice." The pleasure is all mine, James returned with a smile, the energy in his voice high. I appreciate the opportunity to address my brothers in name directly. He borrowed that little bit of phrasing from Morgoth. It felt fitting here. They were all Deathworlders. Speaking of him, he obviously noticed the absolute colossus in the crowd as he turned to look at them. The Lego Mordular towered even over the bigger ones of the other Deathworlders as he gently clapped one of his massive hands onto the back of the other. Noticing James's gaze, he also gave a brief nod of approval at James's words. Other familiar faces James noticed in the crowd were of course Ajaxia, whose mechanical eye was quite noticeable even among many faces. The Rushgat King, who was tall enough to stick out of most of the mass, additionally to his rather unique appearance, helping with spotting him, and Quaffrem and Loijavar, who had been irritating enough presences in James's life that he would have spotted them even if they had been literal needles in haystacks. The felines stood closely together, and Loijavar seemed rather curious about James's appearance on stage, with his ears perked up and his head inquisitively tilted, while the white lion himself had a rather unamused, scrunched-up expression that spoke of a certain level of being displeased about the human being invited now, after the primate had been excluded at first. Although, obviously, he recognized many more species than that, even if he didn't know the representatives personally. First of all, allow me to congratulate you on... Levexar then began to continue speaking, but James lifted his hand to gently indicate to stop, with a chuckle and a headshake. Please, he said with a warm expression. I have had that every day with the primates recently. Any more congratulations and they'll start oozing out of my ears. He raised his eyebrows and tilted his head a bit, while still smiling at the Vulpine. The Lakshaset hesitated for a moment, before scoffing amusedly through his teeth, and giving James a mild nod. From the crowd, there wasn't an overwhelmingly positive reaction or anything, but at least some of the assembled people chuckled slightly at his aloof demeanour. Well, with the primate conference over, you will be free of that for a bit, Levexar continued his greeting, after a moment of waiting to allow the crowd to quiet down for a bit. Now you're speaking as a Class 4 Deathworlder, a rather high classification, higher than most in the room. Well, higher or equal to all but one of the people gathered here, James replied with a casual shrug. But who's counting, really? Not like that has any actual effect. There was a bit of mumbling and a few acceptingly tilted heads. Quite, Levexar agreed. And I believe that is also not what everyone here is actually curious about. After all, you have made quite the statement recently, after the Council of Primates had officially opened its conference. I believe, especially here among your fellow Deathworlders, many people would like you to tell us about your most interesting ally. James swayed his head slightly from side to side, as if mulling that request over. Then, after a few moments, he looked back at Levexar. Well, I know that people are probably interested in that, but let's be honest here. Me and her, we're a bit too close. I mean, if she's my ally, and I've already publicly defended her, how much more can I really say on the topic? You already know that I trust her. You know that I'm working with her. What else could I possibly say that would convince people of that? He said thoughtfully, and crossed his arms with a confident smile. Then he reached one hand out flatly and pointed it at Levexar, as if he was offering him the word as a physical thing. But hey, you talked to her, he said with a warm tone. Why don't you tell the people what you think, as someone who is far less involved with her than I am? Levexar's large ears twitched slightly, and he blinked twice at the suggestion. Oh, me? The Vulpine said, and cleared his throat awkwardly. However, after taking a moment to shake off his first mild shock at James reversing the question back to him, he seemed to understand the human's angle, and he started to smile as well. You're right. It's probably not exactly convincing to ask one of her friends if she's a good person. But, well, when I talked to her, she seemed reasonable. At the very least, I didn't pick up on anything that would indicate any underlying disdain for organics or anything like that. Although, obviously, I assume she was on her best behavior. James nodded a couple of times, and then made a rolling gesture with his arm. "Yeah, you're right there," he said, and nodded a couple more times before turning to the crowd. "And also, obviously, you talked to her through me, full disclosure." He looked at the crowd for a moment with an almost calming hand gesture, as he said that before continuing. "So obviously I could have discussed things to say with her beforehand, or influenced things otherwise. But we're also not the only ones who knew about her. Hey, in fact, we aren't even the first ones." His eyes zeroed in on a pale spot in the crowd, and he could see blue feline eyes widen as they realized what he was about to do. James, however, did not even hesitate as he lifted his mechanical hand to point directly at the white lion. "Qua frem," he said loudly, causing a wave of people in the crowd to immediately turn their heads towards Dunama's de facto leader, in a motion that looked like an ocean parting. "You harbored and concealed a Veselon on your world for quite a while before even I came along. Why didn't you tell us a bit about her?" He made a beckoning motion for the old feline, who seemingly did his best to conceal his murderous gaze at the human, although there was only so much one could do when truly furious. Qua Frem rarely lost his composure, but in this case, it seemed like he had, for once, actually not expected to be directly called out like this. After a moment of his boss just staring at James, Loijavar took the initiative and leaned into Qua Frem, whispering something into his employer's ear before nudging him slightly forwards. And, after seemingly emptying the entirety of his lungs with a hiss through his sharp teeth, Qua Frem's face seemed to calm some more before he began slowly sauntering towards the stage. During his short walk, the feline seemed to regain some of his bravado, and once he reached the stage, he was basically swaggering with every step, his tail erected high into the air and swaying in small wave motions. "Now, your people and mine may be allies now, but a Veselon was already known to you long before that became reality. Isn't that correct?" James asked him, keeping his high energy up as well. "Indeed, that is correct," Qua Frem confirmed. Most of the animosity was gone from his face, but his ears still twitched in slight agitation as he spoke, although the only reason James even noticed that was because he was so intimately familiar with Amiet's body language. "I was aware of her existence. We weren't exactly on friendly terms." "But you knew she wasn't dangerous," James quickly chimed into the explanation, before he would give the man too much room to spin his yarn. "Otherwise, you would have surely done something about her, right?" Qua Frem's eyes glimmered angrily at him for a second, but the pale man managed to keep it otherwise contained, this time. "I had no reason to believe she was," he confirmed, without a moment of hesitation. "As you already told the entire galaxy, non-hostile realized have a known history on Dunama. Ever since the hero Ketiaion, they have been treated with respect as a default. We, of course, heeded the warning of possible danger that the galactic community brought with it. However, we were still willing to at least wait until any newborns would show signs of aggressiveness before we would start making any moves towards possibly eliminating them as dangers." He exhaled slowly through his teeth and tilted his head slightly as he looked at James, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. "But, of course, that's all a bit more complicated now that the planet's been attacked over her." He tagged onto his statement. James narrowed his eyes right back at Qua Frem. For a moment, they simply made quiet eye contact, telling each other wordlessly that they knew exactly what game the other was playing. However, that moment passed. It was a battle they would have to fight on a different field. "Quite," James agreed with a nod. Then he smirked at Qua Frem. "But hey, that's what our fleets are for, aren't they? We'll make sure something like that won't happen again." "Indeed," Qua Frem said soon enough, and made an acknowledging movement with his head. After one more moment of quiet eye contact, James then turned right back to the crowd. "As you can see, it doesn't matter where you come from, be it from a background of friendly AIs, he explained, pointing at Qua Frem first. Then he pointed at himself and added, "or a background of incredibly hostile ones." Then he pointed at Levexa as he finished his statement. Or from one with no realized at all. Everyone who talked to her individually agrees that she's a reasonable person, and I'd say that's enough to at least give her a chance to prove herself. So, what can I tell you about Avezalon that you don't already know? Not a whole lot. At least nothing that would be more convincing than the simple fact that we trust her. He pointed at Quaffram again. The Miat trust her, he said, before pointing at himself again. The humans trust her. Then he shifted once more to Levexa, and with some luck, the lecture set will trust her as well. And if we can all trust her without immediately being doomed, I think that's a pretty good sign that she isn't as destructive as Hyokshine, Merilasuna, or stars forbid, a Michael. He simply listed off some of the better-known destructive AIs that had popped up on Deathworlds in the past. However, the direct mention of their names seemed to have the intended effect of people looking around and mumbling quietly to each other. Stepping past the people standing with him, James walked closer to the microphone, a confident smile on his face. But even if she was, he said, and casually put his hand on the side of the mic while glancing across the crowd, bobbing his leg slightly in a casual motion. What do Hyokshine, Merilasuna, and Michael have in common? He paused for a moment, while people glanced around again, quietly whispering about what he might be getting at. You mean, apart from all being realized, right? The Sippersling representative asked loudly after a moment. James smirked wider and lifted a finger to point at the man in a waggling motion. You got me there, he said with a chuckle. Yes, I mean apart from that. He waited for a moment longer as he looked around. Then, he lifted his finger to point up instead as he said, They're all dead. He paused for a moment to let that sink in, before he continued with, And who beat them? Us. He put his hand onto his chest. We, the Deathworlders, we beat them, he said firmly for a moment. Then he lowered his demeanor a bit, again, and tilted his head quickly as he added, Well, we're not the only ones, of course. Not only Deathworlds had hostile AIs, so obviously other species had dealt with them as well, but that doesn't really defeat my point. In fact, I would say it strengthens it further. James began to walk back and forth in front of the mic for a moment, as he continued talking. But, you see, we are Deathworlders, he said, with a strong emphasis on the title. We are understood to be strong, and we are assumed to be dangerous. Hell. He paused for a moment, and lifted his left arm again to show off his scars with a chuckle in his voice. Some of us have proven in the past that we damn well can be. Some people in the crowd chuckled along with him, and he allowed them to quiet down before he continued his explanation with a much more calm and direct voice. Once again, he placed his hand flatly on his chest. But, well, I'm just speaking for myself here, but I personally don't like it when I'm just assumed to be dangerous, he said, and his eyes mellowed out a bit, as his energy sank to a more personal level. I have the capacity to hurt someone. Don't get me wrong, I certainly have the ability. And it's no secret that others like me have done it in the past. Hell, others like me have done it just recently, on this very station. But does that make me dangerous? Is the mere possibility that I could theoretically hurt someone more easily than someone else could be enough to make it worth assuming that I would do it? He looked over at the crowd and shook his head. I don't think so, he stated, and I don't want it to be true. He took a deep breath and stopped his pacing as he stood in front of the microphone again. And if it's not true for me, he finished his statement in a completely earnest and personal tone as he made eye contact with as many people around him as he possibly could, then I cannot in good conscience assume it to be true for anyone else either. Be that people thrice my size, he said, and pointed over at Morgoth, who stood in the crowd and gently nodded along. Be that people with unnatural strength, he listed further, and pointed at his own right arm. Then he shrugged and pointed vaguely around him. Or be that people so powerful that I can't fully imagine it. As long as they don't want to hurt anybody. And as long as they don't make any motions to hurt anybody. Are they really dangerous? Or are they just worthy of respect? He sighed slightly and looked down. You decide, he said as an endpoint. I have said my piece.